All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to this beautiful auditorium, my favorite venue here in Perugia. My name is Antonio Zappulla. I'm the CEO of the Thomson Reuters Foundation, where we work to strengthen free, fair, and informed societies with a combination of media, legal, and data intelligence initiatives. Today, we want to talk about the role of journalism in today's society. And I want to start by looking at some data that some of you might be familiar with. Global trust in traditional media is historically low levels. And I would like to quote the Edelman Trust Barometer. I don't know how many of you follow this index. It comes out every January. It's normally presented at Davos. And it's a global benchmark for truth and trust. And it posts 32,000 people in 28 countries. And according to the Edelman Trust Barometer, the media is the least trusted institution among society. The study polls trust in four main institutions: government, business, the media, and the civil society sector, the NGO sector. So according to the latest findings of the Edelman Trust Barometer, 75% of people around the world believe that journalists lie to them and that the media is intentionally misleading the audience, the public. The report also highlights this lack of trust stemming from this idea that the media embodies an elite that is out of touch with society. And this obviously comes at a time, as we know, where we're seeing a rise of personality-led journalism. We've seen, obviously, in the States, the rise of the podcast by Joe Rogan and Ben Shapiro. We've seen, obviously, and we've spoken a lot about this during this festival, a fundamental shift in consumption, especially with Gen Z accessing information from social media, the creation of echo chambers on social media that we're all familiar with, the fact that we're living really, as it feels, in a post-truth society where facts no longer matter. We're also seeing in this context, obviously, with the latest round of elections, a wave of authoritarian leaders that have been elected democratically. And these leaders have a lot in common. They champion unregulated technology. They take advantage of unregulated technology. They tend to bypass the media and to speak directly to their constituencies. They exploit fears stemming from income inequality, a rise in immigration trends. They champion a nationalist and protectionist agenda. They are openly hostile to the media. And they often introduce legislation that weaponizes the law to silence media freedom in civil society, but also foster this persecution narrative every time they're held accountable by the media or by the judiciary. So we feel that we are at a critical juncture, and we want to ask a couple of fundamental questions today. What is next for journalism? And wanting to be quite provocative, what's the point of journalism if good quality journalism leads to the election of democratically elected authoritarian leaders? We have a great lineup. We have Stefan Lindberg, who's the director of the VDEM Institute. We have Damian Collins, who is a politician and a senior fellow at the Center for Media and Technology and Democracy at McGill University. We have Patricia Campos-Melo, who is the editor-at-large of Foglia di San Paolo, and we have Rito Kapoor, who's the co-founder of The Quint. So I'd like to start with you, Stefan, to set the scene, because the VDEM Institute produces the most respected study on democracy, and the 2025 findings that obviously capture data from 2024 show yet another decline in democratic standards. And the global shift towards autocracies is pretty evident. 45 countries are moving towards autocracy. In fact, the number of autocracies has surpassed the number of democracies for the first time in 20 years. So nearly 3 out of 4 people in the world, that's 72% of the people now live in an autocracy, and that's the highest number since 1978. What is the impact of this shift towards autocracy when it comes to fundamental freedoms, such as freedom of the press?
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for inviting me to come here. If I can get the slides on, let me put this in context. So VDEM, Varieties of Democracy, we now have a database of 31 million data on democracy, media freedom, and so on. And this is the last report that came out a few weeks ago, 25 years of autocratization. So it's been going on for a long while. You can see the graph to the right there. That's the Liberal Democracy Index over the last 50 years. And the end of 2024, we are now back to a level of democracy enjoyed by the average global citizen that we last saw in 1985, the year that Gorbachev came to power in the Soviet Union. So it's a radical shift backwards over these 25 years. And actually now, 3 out of 4 people in the world live in countries that are not democratic. That, I think, put things in perspective. Also, if we look at, so here's the graph, so what you referred to, Antonio, over the last 50 years, and the blue line there is the number of countries every year in democratization moving forward. We were going from 1974 to the mid-late 1990s in a world where more and more countries were moving towards democracy. And then you see the red shaded area here over the last 25 years, the number of countries, that red line, going up, the number of countries that are autocratizing at the same time. That number, at the end of that, so 48 and then 45 countries now, at the same time moving back on democracy. Antonio, it's never been this many countries in the world at the same time moving back on democracy and media freedom at the same time. This is worse than the 1930s. It's never been, there were more countries in the world in the 1930s, but it's never been a greater share of the world's countries at the same time moving back on democracy. It's worse than the 1930s.
What are the consequences, the direct consequences for media freedom that you see? I mean, these are terrifying numbers.
Yeah. So media freedom and freedom of expression in general obviously is part of this. Media freedom is the aspect of democracy that in these countries, and actually more, are attacked often first and the most. In the past 10 years, there were 44 countries where media freedom has moved back, been attacked and undermined substantially and statistically significant. 44 countries in the last 10 years only. So the consequences for media freedom of what's happening here are very radical. And we see that now, of course, also happening in the United States under Trump.
Can you speak about that? I mean, I know obviously your research looks at data from 2024, but what do you see happening in the US right now?
It's a frontal attack on democracy in many ways. Right? All institutions of accountability are being undermined, including the media. And we saw what happened very early with Washington Post, with Bezos' instructions and so on. There is increasing number of journalists being harassed and threatened for their life if they write critically about the government. United States is such a what should I say, extreme, illuminating example of something we see happening across the world and has been happening across the world in the past 25 years. Democracy dies with the lies. Democracy cannot survive in an environment perpetuated by lies. And of course, that's where media and real media and honest media and truth-seeking media, fact-speaking media is absolutely essential. I mean, just think about it. The simplest thing we do in a democracy, that's going to that ballot box. Pick a ballot and put it down. It's so simple, especially in the United States or UK, with essentially only 2 parties, right? Did you like what the people in power have been doing, what they chose not to do, and so on? You like it? Okay, well, we'll vote for them again, right? No, I didn't like that, and they should have done other things, and they didn't do this, and, I want them to. So, well, pick another one. Well, try another one. Boom. If we as citizens go to that ballot box, and when we look at what they did or they didn't do, what they said or didn't, and what we believe about that are lies, then that ballot becomes meaningless. There's no accountability. If we don't know what they did or didn't do, well, then that's why democracy dies with the lies.
Let's come back to accountability. I want to move to Damien because, Damien,
Thank you for the slides. You can take them off.
By the way, if you want to, this is an incredible report, which is also online, and it's obviously VDEM Institute Democracy Report, 25 years of autocratization, democracy trumped. This is the latest report that Stefan was referring to. Damien, I would like to come to you because you bring a really interesting perspective, especially here in Perugia, because obviously you are a member of the Conservative Party, you've been a member of parliament between 2010 and 2024, by the way, in the UK. You've been Minister for Department of Digital Culture, Media and Sport. And the UK government remains strongly committed to media freedom. In fact, it was a Conservative government, the previous government, that created the Media Freedom Coalition, which is a coalition of governments that are committed to media freedom, as the name suggests. In the current political spectrum, though, a Conservative government championing media freedom seems to be almost now out of sync with what we're seeing around the world, precisely because of the points that Stefan has raised. I would like to understand the genesis of this within your experience in government, why the UK government, especially Conservative government, committed towards media, made those commitments towards media freedom, and also understanding how did we get here, like an issue as fundamental, such as media freedom, is no longer a bipartisan issue. We're seeing the word democracy being captured in the US, the word freedom being captured in the US. How did we get here from your political perspective?
Thank you. Well, if you go back 10 years or so, maybe not quite that far, but 7 or 8 years, where a lot of the debate around the role of media, future of media within online spaces became much more current, where we became much more aware of the impact and the prevalence of disinformation networks. I think there was a reasonable amount of cross-party consensus around this being a problem. A long-standing concern that essentially Meta and Google are advertising businesses. Their advertising model was eroding the advertising model that had supported the media industry for over 100 years. And we were seeing the closure of lots of smaller titles. And in more oppressive regimes, you'll see governments going after free expression in the media. And we recognize that if you believe in democracy, then democracy is a lot more than voting. It's about having an open society where people can express their views freely. Now, I think there was a reasonable amount of consensus around that. When you looked at how we went about regulation of online spaces in particular, I think there was a very strong bipartisan support for enforcing the law online, where offences were being committed, be they safety offences or competition offences, that regulation touched those platforms, that the rest of the world didn't accept the system that exists in America, where the platforms are seen as intermediaries and they have protections in law from any kind of liability, that we didn't accept that. And I think that has continued to be the case largely. So for me as a conservative, it is a logical thing to want people's rights and safety to be protected online as we would do in the physical world. What has happened, though, is this is being attacked, I would say, not by mainstream political voices in most of the democratic world, but by the extremist and populist voices. Now, the news distribution system, the erosion of traditional media, has allowed populist movements to rise. And those populist movements that are benefiting from the way social media is amplifying and projecting more extreme opinions are on the whole the people that are most against regulating it, unsurprisingly. I think America is an outlier here, where the American right use language which is more reflective of the populist political movements elsewhere in the world and not of the centre-right parties you would find not just in the EU but in the UK, Australia and Canada as well. And I think if you look at J.D. Vance's speeches both in the Paris AI Summit and in the Munich Security Conference, I think it is a gross distortion what he is saying. To say that in Europe we do not have free speech, and that the precursor to a free trade agreement with America is having free speech in Europe. I mean, it's just a gross distortion of the situation. And what they're talking about is not, they might try and pick what they think are the most egregious examples of where people's free speech rights are being interfered with. But we know freedom of speech, and even in America, freedom of speech has always come with guardrails, that you can't use your speech to incite hatred, harassment, and violence against other people. I think even on disinformation, Donald Trump has asserted that it doesn't really exist. Well, does that mean that, say, denying the Holocaust happened in the Second World War is a matter of opinion? That is just as valid as believing it did happen when it's a historical fact that it did. So I think we have to challenge some of these assumptions that are coming out, particularly from the Trump administration, and say, no, actually, we have got rights and standards, we will defend them, they're not going to be traded away, and that we do not accept the assertion that you're making. And one of the reasons they're advocating for this is the American companies want to have a big rollback from the trust and safety responsibilities they agreed to take on when we became more aware of the problems online. They don't want the cost of doing it, they don't want the responsibility of doing it, and the people that support them are people that enjoy the deregulated chaos of media environments today. So, defending the free press is about standing up for journalists' rights, championing their freedoms, the work they do, supporting news organizations, but also being prepared to regulate the ecosystem through which information is distributed.
And we'll come back to the role that you played in, obviously, in your role as a minister and the famous committee when Zuckerberg didn't show up. I will come back to that in a minute because I'm really keen to also understand the relationship between politics and big tech, especially given your first-hand experience. I want to move to the two journalists that are actually coming from geographies where we have seen already this move towards authoritarianism. I'll start with Patricia because you've been here before, we've been on panels before, you have a direct experience of the Bolsonaro government attacks towards you personally. We spoke about lawfare many times and how the law has been weaponized to try to silence you and your journalism. You fought back, you sued Bolsonaro and his son, you won. But I'm really keen to understand what practical insights you can share with journalists that are now working in countries that are seeing this shift towards authoritarian regimes. What lessons can you share given your first-hand experience? And then I would like to talk about the role of reporting the Lula administration. Obama once said that Lula was the most popular politician on earth. In this new mandate, we know and we're seeing that he's not. Obviously, the economy is not on his side. But as a journalist who has experienced firsthand the attacks of a government that is not democratic, how do you cover the government that comes after with objectivity and without paving the way for a return of an anti-democratic government?
Thank you, Antonio. Thank you for the invitation. I think first we should always keep in mind that it is a global phenomenon. There's a playbook. So we should all brace for impact. It's coming. Leaders all around the world, they're watching what Donald Trump is doing, and they're going to do the same. I remember during the Bolsonaro administration, it was almost ridiculous, like not creative. Like 1 week after Trump canceled the subscriptions for several media outlets, such as the New York Times, Bolsonaro canceled the subscriptions. While Trump was putting pressure, or actually Modi was putting pressure, and Orban was putting pressure on private advertisers not to advertise on critical media, Bolsonaro was convening business leaders to do the same. The same sort of, persecution and trying to make it more difficult to access public data. So now that we're seeing the second Trump administration that is way worse for journalism and for the media, we should keep in mind that this is going to be exported to other countries and other leaders. And because it's much worse, we should expect the use of regulatory agencies the same way that Brandon Carr is using the FCC and Trump is using the FCC, to persecute or intimidate media outlets, try to discuss legislation that's going to criminalize journalism. So I think this is something that is a global phenomenon, and it is coming. And there comes the challenge. How do you keep journalism independent when you're covering the administration that comes after the government that threatened democracy? You need to keep critical reporting. but you can never equalize the two things. Right now, as you said, President Lula has the lowest approval rate of his administration. I mean, disapproval rate is way above food inflation. I mean, it's the whole Biden thing repeated. So there's a big chance that Bolsonaro in some version, maybe not himself because he can't run, although he could reverse that, but he might be coming back next year in the presidential elections. So it is really important to not fall into this trap of both sidism, as you say. Yes, we have to be critical. Yes, the administration is making mistakes, and we need to keep covering that. But never let people forget or rewrite history of what just happened.
And do you think people forget?
I totally think people forget. Just like in the US, where President Trump pardoned people who were involved in January 6th, in Brazil, there's a huge campaign for amnesty against people who were involved also in our January 6th, which was January 8th, 2023. And, this rewriting of history that, it was not an attempt to reverse election results. It was just poor ladies, old ladies with Bibles and popcorn sellers and, such an injustice. So we need to keep reminding people and ourselves that it was a threat and it was narrowly averted. And so I think this is one of the duties that we have at this point.
Ritu, we've spoken about the playbook. You obviously in India, and you've seen, especially in India, the media industry being so polarized. How do you do objective journalism in an environment where you have an autocratic regime, you have a media ecosystem that is so polarized? And how do you feel about doing objective journalism when we are in a climate where we feel that collectively maybe we're not heard? It doesn't matter anymore because of these echo chambers, because of the direct approach of these authoritarian leaders. Tell us a little bit more about your direct experience.
I think if you were to let yourself be overwhelmed by everything that's happening and you're constantly having those conversations in the newsroom, I don't think we're going to be able to make any difference. I think the focus really, at least in our newsroom, is specifically on the kind of stories we want to do and to make sure that none of our stories or none of our journalism is reacting to the events. That you're not doing your journalism from a place of anger and frustration. Because I think in a time when there is, we've all talked about it for the last 2 days, declining trust in journalism, if your reader or your consumer feels that you're also coming from a side. But having said that, I think you need to be able to constantly be critical of the government by specifically raising data points, by not just sort of sweeping broad opinion pieces, because I think that's the other problem that audiences are now reacting to, that there is way too much opinion coming from independent news organizations. But I think the other part, the other mission, I think now is a time when I don't think any of us are looking at news media as a business. I think you're not looking at it from a, where is the revenue coming from? I don't think the word profit is even mentioned anywhere else. It's really how do you sustain yourself? I think the responsibility to push back against apart from doing specific stories, is to push back against the fear factor.
Fear factor within the newsroom or within society?
In the country. Now, for instance, it's not just journalists, right, in India. Now, there are activists who have been in jail without bail. There are stand-up comics who have been arrested. There's the stand-up comic who was arrested for a joke they thought he might crack. There are student activists who, just on the basis of a WhatsApp message, have now been languishing in jails in India for 4 or 5 years. There are no bail hearings. Now we've started celebrating not people being acquitted. There's a celebration when somebody is, a bail hearing happens and when bail is given. Now, so it's a declining. I think this fighting back against this, this chilling factor, I think that is a responsibility of an independent newsroom in India today as well. You see, because unlike Trump, you talked about exporting, Trump exporting. I think we've been exporting a lot of the playbook well before. So it's funny how while there are tariff wars happening when it comes to and in the time of protectionism and nationalism, I think there is a globalization of authoritarianism. No traffic, no tariffs there, absolutely. But the difference in India is that it hasn't been this overt, overnight, dramatic stamping down of democratic institutions. It has been an insidious, gradual erosion of constitutional protection, of institutional independence, like I talked about, students and activists and journalists, of course, basic civic freedom. It's sort of crept up on us. So the kind of anger and pushback that a Trump gets because everything that he's doing is so dramatic and sudden, this has been very quiet. As we all know, Modi has not given a press conference. It's his 11th year. So I think that's how you have to just keep your focus. Otherwise, if you start reacting to everything, then your journalism is of anger, which is not the kind of journalism that audiences are going to respond to.
Can I just add just a quick, I just want to say that I 100% agree with Rito in the sense that we need to do more reporting and investigative reporting instead of opinion. I think the readers, the public, they feel like they're being lectured or, that you come from. So, reporting, like this is our core business, investigative reporting. I think it's time to focus on that.
I want to go back on the Modi versus Trump because, when we spoke on the phone, Stefan, you made a really interesting point. You said Trump has achieved what Modi did in 10 years in 8 weeks. Was it right?
Yeah, in about 4 weeks.
4 weeks.
Yeah. Modi in India is very typical for the last 25 years of autocratization in the world. That has been sort of the modus operandi. It took about 10 years to do away with democracy in India. We don't no longer count India as a democracy. It also took about 10 years for Orban in Hungary, Erdogan in Turkey, and so on. We can go down the line. But Trump in the United States is sort of squeezing those 10 years, 8 to 10 years, into 4-5 weeks. And I said before the election in American media that I'm 99.9% sure that democracy in the United States will not survive another round with Trump. We see that happening now. If it continues like this, there won't be a democracy left to speak of in the United States by the end of the summer.
That's quite a frightening point. Another point that really petrifies me is looking at the younger demographics, because we always talk about, but even when Brexit happened, this is different demographics, there's going to be a change in demographics. There was a poll commissioned by a political party here in Italy. Those of you who are Italian will know the party is called Azione. It's a very small centrist party. They commissioned this independent polling by SWG, and it shows that 42% of Italians right now, between the age of 18 and 24, would be in favor of electing a prime minister that would govern with no checks and balances from government in order to restore growth, security, and prosperity. What's even more chilling is that the percentage of those in favor of this strong man or woman approach goes up to 52% among those aged between 25 and 34. But then it drops to 20%, 28% among those who are 64 and above, maybe those who have a little bit more of historical memory. Is this a trend? And can you help us dissect this trend? What's happening? Why are the younger demographics so lenient and prone towards this shift towards autocracy?
Yeah, it is a trend, and we've seen this in other surveys as well, the World Value Survey, the different barometers and so on, that young people have, in the past sort of 10 years or so, have this increasing tolerance for authoritarianism, answering, yeah, it would be good with a leader that doesn't have to care about elections and parliament. Things like that.
Where does it come from? Is it because we're no longer teaching history properly in school? I mean, where does it come from?
We don't really know, right? But my intuition here is that it's the younger demographic, they are affected much more by what we see is a general, very strong correlation between this spread of disinformation in social media and then increasing polarization and then autocratization. That relationship is incredibly strong, both at macro level with sort of country level data, but also at the micro level in individuals. And hey, all these surveys also show that young people get their political information via social media. Even in Sweden, right, in the last election, young first-time voters got almost all their political information from Instagram. I mean, it's.
I think that's a factor, but I think you have to I don't disagree with anything you said, but also poverty is the reason. If you're a young person and you're struggling to get work, you can't afford housing, you look at the society that your parents and grandparents created and say, well, it worked for them, but it's not working for me, then you are going to look at alternative voices. So there's a media ecosystem which makes populism and extremism easier to export. There's also a receptive market for it as well. And I think basically governments are there to act, and if governments are unable to act and deliver, people look elsewhere. And those undercurrents of concern are being ruthlessly exploited. But it's definitely, the factor is that too many young people, for understandable reasons, feel society isn't delivering for them.
And in this context, what's the role and the responsibility, quite frankly, of technology? And in your role as a minister, you convened Zuckerberg for a parliamentary committee. He never showed up. That was in the fallout of the Cambridge Analytica scandal. We've seen huge amount of disinformation coming from Russia, meddling into the latest European elections in Germany. We've seen it really well, speaking about the younger demographics. As a politician, what do you realistically think, what power do you realistically think to have in order to have this meaningful dialogue with the technology companies?
Well, the reason we wanted Mark Zuckerberg to come, so I convened an international grouping. We had about 30 parliamentarians from 10 countries, and we wanted to question Mark Zuckerberg on the basis that he couldn't go to every parliament in the world, so if we brought a number together, then he might come to one, and he didn't. And the reason we wanted to question him was because ultimately you want to question the decision makers and the people whose job it is to know everything that goes on. Because when you try and question these companies, you get a wall of obfuscation and a serious attempt to not share information. With Cambridge Analytica, if Facebook was serious about the problem, they would have acknowledged their systems were being used by the Russians. They'd have cooperated with governments, researchers and others to help identify the problems, identify those networks, act against them and remove that content from the platform. What they actually did was largely deny it was taking place, or if it did take place, it was taking place in such a small level it wasn't a problem. And they denied access to data from the platform and only focused on a tiny area of concern and activity. Now, so that's in 2018. Since then, these problems have all got worse. The platforms, as we've heard throughout this conference, have largely made it harder and harder for external researchers to analyze it. They produce what they call transparency reports, which really are a shield against what's really going on inside the companies. And unsurprisingly, within governments, in many governments, the desire to actually get to the truth has become stronger and stronger. We now see people like Mark Zuckerberg actually using the language of populist politicians to attack what he calls legacy media for daring to question their business model and their practices and these issues that we see. So, and I think we've reached a point where people have to really question for themselves, if they're aligning with those companies, if they're sitting on oversight boards, if they're accepting commissions for research from those companies, are they helping the problem or are they making it worse? And I think if you're collaborating in those sorts of ways, you're making it worse. And sadly, we've come to a point where if we want meaningful answers and meaningful change, we have to create in law the powers that enable us to do that.
Patricia, there's a lot of dialogue between US journalists and journalists from Brazil and India who have come from what we just discussed. I hear conversations around backing up data for fear of being deleted, like public information data. How do you prepare, or what advice can you practically give to journalists that are now, again, entering this? And how do you yourself prepare for a potential return of an anti-democratic government in Brazil?
This is, you just mentioned one of the main things, backing up data. And if we think about what just happened in the US, they're erasing all this data from government websites. This is something that we should, as society, or get together as journalists to...
Can you articulate which data we're talking about so that the audience has
We're talking about data related to gender, to equity, to race, climate change. That's all been erased from, including research on those topics. That's all been ordered to be erased by the Trump administration in several ministries, departments. And during the Bolsonaro government, we had like a similar experience, in general, but not specifically with these topics, but also relating to COVID. And once we managed to have big media outlets and small media outlets getting together as a task force to get data directly from primary sources, which was COVID data from state governments, because the federal government was basically hiding data, distorting data. So this was something that gave us hope, that sometimes you can put competition aside. Competition is really good. Let's not, right? We all need to be competing against our competitors, but get together as different entities of journalism and ensure we have access to data. So these kinds of coalitions, we had this, it was the COVID, the data coalition, it really worked. So this is something we should be thinking ahead and trying to conserve and back up all this data, because, we just saw, and it's not hard for a government to do this. That's what's really scary.
Ritu, I want to speak about the business model. You just said we are no longer even concerned about the word profit. We're just almost becoming a mission, societal mission, to restore hope and keep society sane. But we're also talking about the paradox of being in a moment in time where we want quality information accessible, but because of restraints and obviously pressures and the huge change that's been affecting the industry from a business point of view, we have paywalls propping up. How do you navigate this dilemma? We need to have a paywall because we need to stay in business, and at the same time, we want our information to be crucially available to a large amount of people because they will depend on that information.
Yeah, I think before you reach the paywall, look at how you're doing your journalism. I think the time for trying to be what used to be called everything for everybody journalism, I think that time has passed for various reasons other than economic reasons. But also within that, I think either as a journalist or as a media or a news media offering, you need to be clear about what is the kind of journalism you want to do. I don't think you can try and do everything. Now, for instance, for us at the Quint, where data in India is not always correct data available. The government data, the stats are not necessarily always reliable. So our focus really is on ground reporting, which we look at as visual evidence reporting, because that really helps build trust as against just text on paper, where the feeling from the audience is that anyone can write anything. But when I'm constantly going on the ground and I'm constantly getting those voices, now the question is funding for ground journalism. The good thing now is that if you're a journalist who's keeping, or a media house that is keeping abreast of technology as it's evolving every day, you'll find that it's actually you can do very good journalism without spending too much. Now our journalists, for instance, are shooting themselves, editing themselves, doing the graphics themselves, even pushing out the social media strategy for that one particular story themselves. So I think figure out really what is the kind of journalism you want to do. Now, within that, the issue about revenue or paywall, I think there needs to be a constant conversation with the audience. I think what is a little disappointing to some of the journalists, say, in my newsroom, is the number of people we're being able to reach. That's sort of getting smaller because the audience is very polarized. Traditional media, which is captured by large corporates and political power, are actually belting out the Hindu nationalist propaganda, pushing sort of all sorts of Islamophobic narrative, and that's getting lapped up by larger audiences. So sometimes the disappointment is, who am I reaching? And I think that's where, if you're continuing to tell your story in a way that is attractive, that is accessible, you will keep finding, don't try and just keep reaching out to the same people, don't keep preaching to the converted, so to say. Try and craft your content in such a way that you are in conversation with somebody who's not thinking the way you are thinking, to get into that. So now once you have that, so do less, control costs in such a way that then the paywall doesn't become the guiding view.
The guiding view. It could be lifted potentially at a specific moment in times like elections, coverage, etc. We have 7 minutes, 53 seconds left, so I would like to open this to the audience because I feel that there might be questions in the room. If you can please identify yourself, tell us who you are, who you work for, who you're studying, whatever you want to tell us that brings more context to the question that you're about to ask. Thank you. There's one question coming from.
Hello, hi. My name is Harlow. I am the Director of Digital Security for Freedom of the Press Foundation in the United States. Really happy to hear this conversation. I actually would love to hear more about this discussion you're opening up about paywalls, actually. Two kind of questions regarding that. While I think what you proposed makes a lot of sense, it does, within organizations, how much leeway do you have to align that vision with what business and development actually do? How actually feasible would it be to change the culture of within business and development within newsrooms in order to fit that idea that you just put forth? And especially thinking in terms of AI and how that's kind of been embedded into the publication systems in order to drive audiences towards paywalls that actually are not appropriately placed to reach the audiences that you want.
And that's a question for Ritu, I guess.
Sure. Yeah.
So the advantage of being a small newsroom is that the same person is business and development, and the same person is editorial, and the same person is also the ground reporter. So that makes it easy. But I can tell you that the big traditional media houses in India, like I mentioned earlier, they are completely, and they are being driven by government advertising. I mean, some time back, the government actually said that they will stop government advertising on newspapers that are critical of them. So they are, of course, that's another ecosystem altogether. But I think as a journalist, you've got to be careful about when you're joining any organization, you need to know who owns that news media and why you would want to align and do your work with that versus if I'm not getting any other job, what are my options, even though I have to rely on big tech like YouTube to put my content out. So yes, I don't think the large, big legacy traditional media houses in India are going to look at journalism. I don't think they're prioritizing journalistic integrity over anything else. But when it comes to a small newsroom, or now in India, as I'm sure a lot of journalists who have come out of those traditional newsrooms, which are so suffocating, and they're now they've got huge audiences by just putting out their content on Instagram and YouTube. So I know we diss a lot of big tech, And we're all aware of what big tech does and how its algos. But the point is, in the same environment, with the same algos, some of these journalists in India have been able to find a connect with large, significant audiences. And I think one of the things one of the, well, not so popular or controversial things that I'm constantly saying is, please look at how what we call an influencer is, what are the tricks that she is using to reach out to audiences? Don't become that polarizing, sensational influencer in your editorial. But what is an influencer? Influencer is somebody who's reaching out to a lot of people. It is now more than ever before important that your kind of journalism reaches as many people as against, sitting in a small pool of journalists patting each other's backs.
Patricia, I want to jump in, and then we'll go to another question.
Okay, I just wanted to say the ideal world would be if we could combine the effectiveness of the influencers of reaching the audience and the journalistic process. I mean, if we find out how to do that, this would be,
Let's squeeze in another question over here.
I'm Bjorn from Germany. Thank you very much for the great panel. I was glad that Damien, I think, mentioned that journalism in the end is not a lot if we don't reach an audience. So an independent and resilient distribution structure is as important as good reporting. So as you mentioned a lot of big tech platforms, what is your vision to create an independent, resilient distribution structure for journalism apart from DSA and DSM? So what else can we do in order to make sure that journalism reaches an audience?
Do you want to take this, Damien?
Yeah, thank you. A great question. I think there have been some important initiatives trying to use competition law to try and create fairer distribution. I think, and that's around remuneration for distribution, because you can use the platforms to try and reach an audience, but monetizing that is essential if you're going to pay for journalism. And I think the news bargaining codes in Australia and Canada have produced very mixed results so far. But I think we're a worthy attempt, and I think it says a lot about the values of the platforms that what would be a fairly modest amount of compensation for them to allow news to be freely distributed, they'd rather not pay. In Canada, they're having a general election where there'll be no news on the major social platforms. But that is a tool that has been looked at. I think there's something in that. I think we've not talked about podcasting, which actually has been a huge success in terms of a format which people engage with very willingly, which can be monetized and goes back to the creator. We also need to look, we've not talked about this, but we need to look very seriously at the role of AI in data scraping and creating generic copies of news content. It's going to be a lot harder to run a news service with a paywall if someone can basically copy what you do and give it away for nothing. And the reason we should be fearful of that is if the incentives of the platforms is basically that copy creates engagement, which drives advertising revenue, if you can get rid of having to pay a journalist to write it for you and just give it, have an AI create it for nothing, which is written in the style of the New York Times or whatever journal you favor, then we have to be fearful of that as well. So these are probably, some of these answers are defensive, but I think we have to be alert to the problems coming down the line and look at how we use, I think, competition law to protect the free interests of people whose business is journalistic enterprise and content creation. We understand the intrinsic value of that to society and to democracy, but also recognize it's a business that should have the right to distribute itself fairly. Book publishers will tell you a lot about the travails they have with trying to distribute and sell their wares through major sort of retail platforms where the terms of trade can turn against you very fast. And so we have to be alert to these problems.
Time is up. Unfortunately, thank you for your experience, your time, Stefan, Damien, Patricia, and Ritu, and thank you for being here with us.